The year was 1847. The Mississippi Delta stretched endlessly under a merciless Sunday. Cotton fields swayed like white oceans, and in the heart of this brutal empire stood the Whitmore Plantation. Behind its grand columns and polished floors, a desperate father was about to make a decision that would change everything. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. Thomas Whitmore was a broken man. He stood in his daughter's room, watching her struggle to breathe. Catherine, 22 years old, bedridden. Her body had swelled to nearly 400 pounds. The doctors had come, one by one. They prescribed tonics, bloodletting, starvation diets. Nothing worked. She was dying, and Thomas knew it. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Thomas owned 63 slaves. Among them was a man the others called Solomon the Healer, a man who said nothing, who kept his eyes down, who worked the tobacco fields from sunrise to sunset. But the whispers among the enslaved told a different story. They said Solomon knew secrets, ancient knowledge passed down through generations, that he could heal wounds that wouldn't close, stop fevers that wouldn't break. Thomas had ignored these whispers for years, until desperation made him listen. On a humid August evening, Thomas did something no plantation owner had ever done. He walked to the slave quarters himself. He found Solomon sitting alone, carving a piece of wood by candlelight. "They say you're a healer," Thomas said, his voice trembling. Solomon didn't look up. "I need you to save my daughter." The room fell silent. Even the crickets seemed to stop chirping. Solomon finally raised his eyes. "And what do I get in return?" Thomas felt his world shift. A slave negotiating with him? But desperation has no pride. "Freedom," Thomas whispered. "Save her, and you'll have your freedom papers." But Solomon's next words made Thomas's blood run cold. "I don't want freedom," Solomon said, his voice steady. "I want authority over her treatment. Complete authority. No interference. No questions. You give me your daughter, and you stay away." What father would agree to such terms? What master would surrender control to his slave? But as Thomas looked at his dying child, he had no choice. The next morning, Solomon entered Catherine's room. She looked at him with fear and confusion. A slave in her private chambers? Impossible. Unthinkable. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice weak. "I'm here to save your life," Solomon replied. "But only if you trust me completely." What happened over the next 6 months would defy everything anyone understood. Solomon didn't use medicine. He didn't use magic. He used something far more powerful. Knowledge. First, he removed everything from her room. The cakes, the pies, the endless platters of fried foods her father had been feeding her out of guilt and love. Catherine screamed. She begged. She threatened to have him whipped. But Solomon stood firm. "Your body is a temple that's been flooded," he said. "Before we can rebuild, we must drain the waters." Then came the walks. At first, just to the door. Catherine collapsed after 3 steps, but Solomon was patient, unmoved by her tears, unbothered by her anger. "Again," he would say. Just that one word. Again. Week by week, something impossible began to happen. Catherine walked to the hallway, then to the stairs, then to the garden. But here's what nobody saw coming. As Catherine's body transformed, something else was happening. She was falling in love with her healer, and he with her. In 1847 Mississippi, this wasn't just forbidden. It was a death sentence. The other slaves noticed first. The way Solomon would steady Catherine's arm during walks. The way she would laugh at his quiet jokes. The way their eyes would meet and linger. Whispers spread through the plantation like wildfire. Thomas heard the rumors. He stood at his window, watching his daughter, now 90 pounds lighter, walking through the gardens unassisted, holding the hand of a man he owned. Rage burned in his chest. But so did something else. Gratitude. The father was at war with the master, and the master was losing. Then came the night that changed everything. 3 plantation owners arrived at Thomas's door. They'd heard the stories. A slave and a white woman. The unthinkable. "You know what has to be done," they said, their faces hard as stone. "The law is clear. Solomon was to be hanged. Catherine was to be sent away to an asylum. The natural order had to be restored." Thomas stood in his study that night, a rope in one hand, freedom papers in the other. Every fiber of his society, his culture, his upbringing, screamed at him to choose the rope. But when he closed his eyes, he saw his daughter, not dying in her bed, but alive. Laughing, dancing in the garden. He saw a man who had done what no white doctor could do. Not through force, not through medicine, but through patience, knowledge, and something else. Love. At dawn, Thomas walked to the slave quarters one final time. He handed Solomon 2 pieces of paper, freedom papers for Solomon, and a signed letter, a testimony that Catherine had requested Solomon's companionship of her own free will, that no crime had occurred. "You have until sunset," Thomas whispered. "After that, I can't protect either of you." As the sun climbed over the Mississippi horizon, 2 figures walked down the plantation road. Catherine, thin and strong, carrying only a small bag. Solomon, free for the first time in 30 years, carrying nothing but knowledge. Behind them, Thomas Whitmore stood on his porch, watching them disappear. His daughter was gone. His reputation would be destroyed. His neighbors would shun him, but she was alive, and she was free. The plantation owners came that afternoon, demanding justice. Thomas met them at the door with a shotgun and a simple statement: "She's my daughter, and I choose her happiness over your approval." This story, documented in letters found in a Mississippi historical archive in 1983, forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What is love worth? What is freedom worth? What would you sacrifice for someone you love? Solomon healed Catherine's body through knowledge that had been passed down through enslaved African healers, understanding of herbs, nutrition, and the connection between mind and body that Western medicine was only beginning to grasp. But more than that, he healed her spirit. He saw her not as a burden, not as a tragedy, but as a human being capable of transformation. And in the most unlikely place, in the most impossible time, 2 people found something that transcended the evil around them. Thomas Whitmore died alone in 1852, ostracized by his community. But in his final letter, found beside his deathbed, he wrote, "I was a master of men, but my daughter's healer taught me what it means to be human." What he did to her body didn't just transform her physically, it set them all free. The historical truth behind the story, while this narrative is dramatized, it represents a real phenomenon in American slavery: enslaved healers who possessed medical knowledge far ahead of their time. Historical facts. Enslaved Africans brought sophisticated medical knowledge including herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and dietary practices. Many plantation owners secretly relied on slave healers when white doctors failed. Among wealthy families in the 19th century, obesity was actually seen as a sign of prosperity. However, it carried the same health risks then as now: heart disease, diabetes, immobility. African healing traditions understood the mind-body connection centuries before Western medicine accepted it. They used movement, nutrition, and psychological support, exactly what modern medicine prescribes today. Relationships between slaves and whites were punishable by death, yet they occurred more frequently than historical records suggest. Some white families made impossible choices between social acceptance and human compassion. Modern lessons. The power of patience and consistency. Solomon's approach mirrors modern behavioral psychology. Small, repeated actions create lasting change. Knowledge transcends circumstance. Even in bondage, enslaved people preserved and shared life-saving knowledge. Love defies systems. Human connection can survive even the most dehumanizing conditions. Health is holistic. Physical transformation requires addressing emotional, mental, and spiritual needs, a truth our ancestors knew that we're only now reclaiming. The real question: how many other stories of compassion, knowledge, and transformation were lost to history because they didn't fit the narrative of their time? And what stories are we missing today because they don't fit ours? Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more untold stories from history.